What's doing, everybody? Welcome to the channel. Appreciate you tuning in as always. If you've never been here before, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell and the thumbs up, and welcome to the channel. For those of you that have never been here before, I served 17 years in the New York prison system straight, and we are going to talk about today what it's like to serve life in prison, what it is like when you are sentenced to a life sentence. Although I did not have a life sentence, my sentence was 12 and a half to 25 years. The majority of men that I spent time with in the maximum security prison system did have a life sentence. I'll explain to you what that means, the different forms of life sentences that there are. So let's get right into it. Let me have a sip of my coffee and we'll get started. How you doing, everyone? Life. Not a thing you would want to be sentenced to prison in. When I say that hundreds of men that I met had a life sentence in prison, that would be the truth. Life does not mean that you will not get out of prison. I know many men that were sentenced to life in prison that made it home. So allow me to explain the sentencing first. If you get the sentence of life without parole in New York State, because states have different laws, this is what you have to be conscious of. In New York State, if you get life without parole, that means you do not have a chance for release. That means you will never see a parole board. In New York State, life means life. So if you get sentenced to life without parole, you're done. You're finished. An example would be someone like Bryan Kohberger, even though he was not sentenced in New York. He has life without parole. That means he never has a chance to see the parole board. The Menendez brothers, they were originally sentenced in California to life without parole. That means they never had a chance to see freedom at all. But then they went down on an appeal and they were resentenced to 50 to life. So now let me tell you what that means when there's a number before life. In New York State, we'll stick with that as an example. If you get 25 to life, that means you have to do 25 years and then go before a parole board who will decide whether they will release you or not. But they can keep you for life. That life means life. They don't have to let you go. You can go, you have 25 years, you go to the parole board, they say you're denied. You go back to the parole board 2 years later. Now you have 27 years served. They say denied, come back in 2 years. You go back 2 years later, you have 29 years served. Denied, come back in 2 years. I've seen that scenario hundreds of times. I know men, personal friends of mine, that have had 25 to life and they have 40 years served in prison. Because every time they go to the parole board says no, they deny them parole. And the parole board can legally do that for life because they had 25 to life, 15 to life, 10 to life. My friend Bobby had a sentence of 3 years to life, which was common for drug possession. He was caught with several kilos of cocaine. He sold several kilos of cocaine to an undercover cop. He was sentenced to 3 years to life. That means after 3 years, he goes to the parole board, but they can keep him for life. I think Bobby ended up going home after 11 or 12 years or something like that. So they didn't keep him for life. So when you have a number in the beginning, 3 to life, 5 to life, 10 to life, 25 to life, that means you must serve the minimum number first. And then you start appearing before the parole board. So to recap on that, if you have life without parole, that means you're doing life. You have no chance of release. You're never seeing a parole board. You're in there for the rest of your life. If you have a number before the life sentence, 10 to life, 15 to life, you must do the minimum number first before you are eligible to be released on parole. Okay, so that's the way life sentencing works in New York State. There are some states where you can get sentenced to life, and life means 15 years. I know that's a little complicated to understand, but that's not in New York State. But there are some states where they'll sentence you to life in prison, and life only means 15 years. That's the way some states work. But New York, life means life. So what does a person with life in prison do all day when they're sentenced to life? I spent most of my time with lifers. That's what they're called, lifers. To give you an example, my buddy Vinny Moraldo, he had 50 years to life. My buddy Tommy Torpy, he had 25 years to life. Just I could go on forever with the people who had life sentences. My friend Kenny, 16 years to life. They were actually, some of those guys were actually released after they did their minimum sentence. Like Kenny had 16 to life, they let Kenny go home at his first parole board. He did 16 years and he was released. They didn't make him do life. Tommy Torpy had 25 years to life. He went to the parole board at 25 years. They released him after 25 years. They didn't keep him for life. But there's a lot of guys that they do keep. Every case has its own set of circumstances. And so you never know what the parole board is going to do, because every case is different. You can't really look at the sentence. You have to look at the crime that the person committed, and then it's really hard to determine the way the parole board works. But let's talk about what men do for life. Men do in prison with a life sentence. They don't do anything much different than someone who's serving 10 years, than someone who's serving 15 years. They don't do anything much different than a guy who's not serving life. Everyone does their time in their own way. So there are men that work on their appeal. They're sentenced to life, so they're very concerned with trying to get that sentence overturned. So they spend a lot of time in the law library. They spend a lot of time trying to write letters to attorneys to get their sentence overturned, to looking to people like the Innocent Project to try and pick up their case. So there are people that spend time working on their appeal and trying to go home. And I would say that it's not the majority. It's the fact is that a lot of people accepted their fate. A lot of guys accepted their fate. There are guys that work on that appeal, of course. It's very hard to work on an appeal because when you're a prisoner, if you don't know the law and you don't have money for a private attorney to handle your appeal, the law is not easy. If you don't dot your I's and cross your T's when filing an appeal, that appeal will be rejected immediately because it was filed incorrectly. And so you really have to learn the law. And that takes a lot of time inside of the law library trying to figure out a very, very difficult criminal justice system that is extremely complicated, and not designed for the benefit of the incarcerated. So there are people that work on getting out. Now, how do they spend their day? Let's say they're not working on their appeal every day. I would say they do their time like anyone that's serving 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. You get into a routine in prison. You wake up every morning and you make your cup of coffee and maybe you go to the recreation yard and work out, and then you come in from working out and jump in the shower. And prison is very routine, very routine. One of the big things with guys in prison is food, is preparing your own food. Instead of going to the mess hall and eating what the prison gives you, eating their breakfast, eating their lunch, and eating their dinner, it's nice when you have your own food. Food is a big thing to guys in prison, because food, you could say it's like a comfort, right? It's that to have personal food is a comfort, and you can get sent in some pretty decent food into prison through the packages. You can order food packages. In New York State, for example, you are allowed 35 pounds of food per month. Okay. You can get that in one package, or you can break it up into two packages. Get 20 pounds and then get a 20-pound package in the beginning of the month and then a 15-pound package towards the end of the month. Or you can just get one package of 35 pounds, And then there were guys, I would get 70 pounds of food a month. I would get 35 pounds under my name, and then I would have my family send, or one of my friends send 35 pounds under my other friend's name who didn't receive any packages. So we would have 70 pounds of food. And you can get really good quality food if you have the money and you have people to send it to you. We used to order from a place in Bangor, Maine, called WA Bean in Bangor, Maine, and they would send really high quality meats. Of course, there was a lot of restrictions on what you were permitted to have in prison. The food would have to say keep refrigerated. It wasn't allowed to say keep frozen. If it said keep frozen, it wasn't permitted in the prison. It had to be fully cooked. So the meat had to be fully cooked, it had to be hermetically sealed, and it had to say keep refrigerated. And then you were allowed to get those things in. So we would get hams and pastrami's and sausages and chorizo sausages and jalapeno sausages and roast beefs. And, we would get this food in. And then from the commissary, we would buy pasta, we would buy rice, we would buy sauce, and we were able to make really good meals. The guys are real. So my point is that guys are serving life. Take a comfort in food. And making food is a big deal because it makes you feel better. The food makes you feel better. You sit down and you eat with your fellow prisoners, the guys that you hang out with. You make a nice pasta meal with sausage and peppers and onions, or you make a nice rice meal, whatever it may be. And so food was a comfort. Guys that are serving life, like I said, many of them do different things. A lot of guys work out. Part of their day is working out. It's a big thing that they go out every day and they work out with the weights every day. I'll give you a brief example of what my routine was every day. You get into a routine when you're in prison. In the morning, I would wake up, and this was almost every day. It's like the same thing. Prison is routine. Prison is routine. But the scary part about prison is that as routine as it is, you never know what's going to happen. At any time, anything can happen. You're going about your routine, and all of a sudden, someone gets stabbed, and the whole routine changes. Or you work out every morning, and you wake up one morning, and they decide not to let anybody outside that day for whatever reason. The prison isn't running recreation, so you get stuck in your cell. So your routine can get a monkey wrench thrown in it at any time. But I would wake up in the morning. I usually didn't go to breakfast because I just didn't want to deal with sitting next to the prisoners in the morning that didn't shower, sitting next to the prisoners that didn't brush their teeth in the morning, sitting next to the prisoners that stink and smell, because there's a lot of them that don't take care of themselves. And so I didn't want to deal with that at 7 o'clock in the morning. And I'm an early riser, so I would wake up at 5:30 in the morning. And the first thing I would do is make a cup of coffee in my cell. I had a hot pot where you can make some coffee in your cell. I'd make a cup of coffee, and then I would get my mail together, because I usually sat in my cell at night and wrote some letters, typed some letters on the typewriter, and I'd wait for the morning recreation. So as all the other prisoners were going to chow, not all of them, a lot of guys didn't go to breakfast in the morning. If you didn't have your own personal food, you had to go. You'd go down there and get their oatmeal and their, whatever they were serving for the morning. But I would stay in my cell and I'd make my own little breakfast. I'd make my own coffee. I'd make a little bag of oatmeal in a hot pot, maybe a little bowl of cereal. I had fresh milk, and so I would sit in my cell and have my breakfast. And about 8 o'clock, say breakfast was at 7 o'clock, about 8 o'clock, 8:30, they would call recreation. And then I would run out to the prison yard. I would go outside into the yard and I would lift weights. That's when I would work out in the morning. And I'd lift weights for about an hour every morning. And the lifers were doing that as well. They were guys that were serving life, and this is what we do. And so my crew in the weightlifting pile was three or four of us. We'd all go to the weight pile and work out together for an hour and a half. Bring my protein drink with me, just like you're going to the gym, and have my protein drink and lift weights. And then I would come back inside into the prison and wash up. And then when you come back into your cell, let's say it's now 10:30, you're waiting for lunch. You lock back inside of your cell. Lunch comes. Lunch, I usually go down to the mess hall and eat lunch. Sometimes I might make myself a tuna fish sandwich in the cell, might make myself a chicken sandwich in the cell, but a lot of times I'll run down to the mess hall and have whatever they were serving for lunch. And then after you have lunch, you go back to your cell. You lock in your cell again, and you're in your cell until they call recreation again. And they call recreation at about 12 o'clock in the afternoon, 12:15, 12:30. It depends what facility you're in. They call, and then I run back out to the recreational yard again. And when I run back out to the yard again, I spend my afternoon playing handball. Some guys will play cards. Some guys will play basketball. Some guys will just go outside to smoke a joint and hang out. Other guys go out to play dominoes. Other guys go out and work out in the afternoon. My afternoons were handball. I would go to the handball court and I would run for about 2 hours, 2.5 hours on the handball court, playing handball. And then the afternoon recreation would be done. I'm sorry if this sounds a little routine or boring, but I'm explaining the boring routine of prison to you. And then I'd come back in the afternoon, wash up, take a shower if I could, if I was able to take a shower, and then I would wash up, and then you wait for dinner. And dinner time, same thing. I'd either go down to the mess hall to have dinner, or I'd make my own dinner in my cell. And what was nice was when I made it into the honor dorm in Attica Prison. See, this is why it paid off to be in an honor dorm for years. You're not locked inside of your cell in the honor dorm. That's all. I'll explain the honor dorm separately. But you're allowed to spend time outside of your cell, and they had an oven to cook in, stovetops, hot plates, refrigerators. Those were the privileges you got when you were in the honor dorm. But when you were in the regular general population, which I was for 5 years in Attica before I made it into the honor dorm, I'd go back into my cell, and then I'd either cook dinner with a couple of my buddies, or we'd go to the mess hall and have dinner again, and then we wait for the evening recreation. And when I went out, they'd call that at about 6 o'clock. Yeah, 6 o'clock. And the evening recreation is long. It's from 6 to about 9, 6:30 to 9:30. So you could stay outside for about 3 hours. You had the chance to do an early go back. You can go out at 6 and come in at 7:30, or you can go out at 6 and stay out till 9. And that's when I would attack the handball court again. I'd run to the handball court for another 2-3 hours. So my routine was work out with the weights in the morning, come back in, breakfast, go back out in the afternoon, play handball, come back in, have dinner, and then go back out at night, play handball again, or hang out with the fellas. Usually I played handball every night. I was addicted. And then now you come back in and into the cell block at 9 o'clock at night. And I would stay up till about 1:30 in the morning studying. That's what I would do. I would spend 4 hours a day easily studying. And I studied a lot of different things. I kind of set a schedule for myself. Like on Mondays, I would study psychology. I was taking courses through the mail. I was taking correspondence courses through Ohio University. And so I would study child psychology, human behavior, and abnormal behavior. Also something called logotherapy. I spent a lot of time studying psychology. And then Tuesday and Wednesday nights, I would study religion. I would study the Bible. I would study all types of religions. I read the Bible 11 times while I was incarcerated. But I didn't only read it, I studied it for long over a decade. I ended up teaching the book. I became very knowledgeable in the writings of the Bible. I read the Muslim Quran 3 times. I read what's called the Jewish Tanakh, the Hebrew Tanakh, the Torah. I read that 4 or 5 times, maybe even more of that. I studied the words of Buddha. I spent a lot of time in religion. And I also studied political science. I studied a lot about politics. I was on a quest for education, and I earned my high school diploma when I went to prison. I didn't even have a high school diploma. So once I earned that, I focused on a secondary education. I didn't do that the first few years of my incarceration. The first few years of my incarceration, I was still doing drugs. I was fighting. I was crazy. I was out of control. And I really calmed down once I got up to Attica and realized I was in a serious place. And if I screwed around, I could end up in there for the rest of my life, because my friends had 50 to life, 25 to life, 30 to life. I had 12 and a half to 25 years. They used to call me short timer. Hey, short timer, with 12 and a half to 25 years. That was nothing to them. Hey, short timer, come here. Let's eat. Yeah, these guys had a lot of time. So the lifers, the guys that were serving life in prison, basically were just doing the same routine that I explained to you that I was doing. I mean, maybe they weren't into handball. Maybe they did, they played dominoes when they went out, or whatever. Everyone had their own little routine. Everyone got into their own little routine. What I explained to you was a program, because I had completed all the mandatory programs. You see, what the routine that I just explained to you was the routine of someone who completed all the mandatory programs. See, because we had so much time in prison to do, and because we had already served 10 years, 12 years, 14 years, we had completed all their mandatory programs. Like, it's mandatory that you go to school to obtain your GED. Myself and my friends, we did so much time already that we had already obtained our GED. It was mandatory that you do a 6-month violence program. We did that program already. It was mandatory that you do a drug program. We completed the drug program already. And it was mandatory that you do at least 6 months in a vocational program. We had done that already. So we had completed all the mandatory programming. And once guys in prison have completed all the mandatory program, which you complete in the first couple of years that you're serving time, basically it's all done. Once you complete the mandatory program, now your schedule is basically what you make it. You go to the program committee, you might have a porter job. Everyone has a job. You might have a porter job, a sweeping job, a mess hall job. See, there were guys that had mess hall jobs, so they couldn't go to the recreational yard like I went to 3 times a day, because in the morning they had to work in the mess hall, or in the morning they had to take a vocational program, or in the afternoon, right? Everyone had their own little routine. So guys with life sentences get into their routine and they just do their time. And you say, well, aren't you thinking about the fact that you're going to be in there for the rest of your life? You don't think about it the majority of the time. I would say that you think about it more at night when the cell door shuts and you're laying in bed and it starts to go through your head. And yeah, but you have no time to dwell. You know what I mean? This is the situation that you're in, and you try and make the best of that bad situation. If I had the life sentence, I would think that I would work on my appeal and trying to get out. But the truth is that many of them will never get out. Some of them will. Just because someone has a life sentence, if they have life without parole, they're not getting out. Unless they go back down on an appeal and they get that life without parole changed to 25 to life, 30 to life, something like that. Or they get it overturned completely and they're able to walk free, which is very difficult. So when you're sentenced to life without parole, the odds that you're ever going to get out are really tough. And if you have 25 to life, 30 to life, you have to do your time. There's nobody you can call to get out. You're not calling mommy or daddy to get out. You're not calling, there's nobody to call. You could write the president, the governor. You're serving your time. Once that judge gives you your time, you're serving it. And so guys with a life sentence get into the same routine that anyone gets. They start doing their time. There's some guys that just turn to drugs. There's some guys, their whole life in prison, they're sentenced to life in prison, and their life is just chasing heroin every day, chasing smoking weed every day, playing basketball all day long, and looking at pornography books. And, there's guys that get sentenced to life and they hardly ever come out of their cell. They're just so depressed and miserable, and they live in their cell, and their existence is nothing but a nightmare for them. There's those guys too, and that's how they serve their sentence. everyone serves it in a different way. Everyone handles it in a different way. How would you handle it is the question. How would you handle being sentenced to life? You know, how would you handle even being sentenced to the sentence that I had, 12 and a half to 25 years, where they kept me for the whole thing? You know, everybody handles it different, you know. So everything I explained is really like how you get by, how you basically take things one day at a time in the routine, but then there's the emotional torture side of it, the times that you lay down and you realize that you may never be free again. You may never be able to walk on the beach again. You will never be able to see your children again in the free world. You will never be able to go to McDonald's again or go out to dinner again. You may never be able to drive a car again, ride a motorcycle again. You'll never be able to walk down a city street and have that feeling of all the people around you. You'll never be able to go to a movie theater again. You'll never be able to have normal relationships in the outside world. This is the torturous part of serving life in prison. And these thoughts go through the men's heads as well. Those thoughts went through my head as well, because you never know, even if you're serving 1 year, if you're going to make it out alive. That is the torturous part. And you try to keep that in the back of your mind, where you don't think about it on an everyday basis. But there's times where you just can't help but think about it. And then as you're serving the extensive years, people start to die off on you. The people that gave you the hope to survive. Your mother may pass away. And then a few years later, your dad passes away. Or your love or your brother or your sister dies, or your best friend dies. All the people that you knew, the life that you had, is disappearing as you're dealing with this incarceration, as you're dealing with this life sentence. And you're dependent on people to help you when you're in there. You really are. You can take care of yourself to the best of your ability, but a lot of people who are incarcerated depend on people to help take care of them. Somebody to call if you need something. Somebody to call if you need someone to make a phone call for you. And that starts to fade away through time. Those people start to disappear, especially as you're serving a life sentence. And you find yourself more and more alone. You find yourself more and more isolated. And, there's two ways that you can look at this scenario. One person can look at this scenario and say, that's what you get. That's what you get for the crime that you committed, and for being sentenced to life. You don't deserve any better than that. You should be tortured like that. There's many people that have this belief. And then there's another belief. And that belief is that some people say, well, they served their time and they've done many years and they're human beings. And what a pity for them to be in there tortured like that for a mistake that they made 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And there's different outlooks, and I would say the only way to decipher which outlook, or I should say, the only way to determine which outlook you should have on those incarcerated is depending upon the person, depending on the person's true nature, depending on the person's crime and what they did, whether it was conscious, whether it was planned, whether it was not planned, whether they're really a good person, but they committed a crime because they ended up falling into drug addiction, or they abused, or there's so many circumstances before you make a judgment on someone and what they deserve and how long they deserve it for. But that's a part of serving a life sentence as well. There's a tremendous amount of pain involved. And you try and block it out with that day-to-day that day-to-day routine that I'm explaining, you know, to the best of your ability. But there's a lot to think about when you're serving life. A lot of self-reflection. A lot of saying, man, I wish I did things differently. I wish I lived differently. I wish I would have done this. I wish I would have done that. The men play that in their mind constantly. You know, there is a tremendous amount of men that are sorry for what they did, truly sorry for what they did, and they wish they never did it. There's an alarming number that aren't sorry. I never put everyone into one category, as you know. But, that's definitely part of it. It's a different world. I just wanted to give you a little idea of what it's like to be trapped in there. And I think everybody, even the men with life, even the men with life without parole, always hold on to this little inkling of hope. And hope is a good thing to hold on to. You know, maybe you'll be let down by holding on to that hope but hope is all you really got to grasp. Hope one day that a law changes. Laws do change. Hope one day that a lawyer contacts you and says he wants to do an appeal. Hope one day that just something happens that can set you free again. Because one of the greatest fears that I had was dying in the prison system. I think a lot of us are afraid of death. Some people will say, of course, I'm not afraid to die. I'm not afraid to die. I'm one of those, I don't want to die. I don't want to die. But I definitely didn't want to die in prison. I said, if I'm going to die, please let me die in the free world. I don't want my spirit and my soul to perish as I'm locked in a cage. It was just not the way I wanted to see an ending for myself. But anyway, let me come to a close. I just wanted to give you a little idea about what it's like when someone is serving life. I'll talk to you guys soon.